We're going to be diving into some of those economic headlines as tariffs has really been one of the top stories that we've been following this year. Want to continue to talk about this latest news out of the White House. Putting this up from the Washington Post, the United States will impose a tariff of 35% on goods imported from Canada starting August 1st. This is all according to President Trump. He's now injecting a fresh element into a strained bilateral relationship that already exists between the United States and Canada. And so we do want to continue on with our coverage here on Live Now from Fox, talking a lot more about this. But of course, we know Canada is one of the largest U.S. trading partners and the latest in a series of countries that have received a letter from President Trump in recent days warning of new tariffs that are all set to take effect on August 1st. To talk a lot more about this, I want to bring into the conversation with political Ari Hawkins. Ari, thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. You've joined us before talking about some of these trade relations between the countries. Again, seems like things are heating up once again between the United States and Canada.
Right. This is the latest escalation of this long-going feud. We saw really since the start of the Canadian presidential or prime ministerial election that tariffs were going to play a major role here. We saw Canada was one of a total of 22 countries now that have received this letter, which effectively from the White House is a signal that countries aren't engaging as they should. They aren't making as many concessions, and this is a nudge from the president to try to move that along. Now, Canada, as well as other countries that have received this letter, have argued vehemently that they are negotiating in good faith and are pretty disappointed by the notion that they aren't engaging properly. But this is the latest escalation. We know that this 35% figure that's now scheduled for August 1st, the White House tells us, will only apply to goods that are not compliant with the current USMCA, the North American Free Trade Agreement that Trump initially signed. But yes, this is a major escalation, and we'll see if it remains in effect on August 1st.
And Ari, we also know that we've been hearing from several administrators also there in the Trump administration speaking out. In fact, Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been on an international trip to Malaysia. He made some comments earlier. I want to play them out and get your response to hearing what he said and what we can really expect to come from this. Let's listen.
At the end of the day, the United States has built these tremendous trade imbalances over the last 30 or 40 years. That's unfair to American and American workers and American, in addition to threaten our industrial capacity. Trade needed to be revisited. The president campaigned on that, and that's what he's doing, and he's resetting it on a global scale. At the end of the day, look, I think countries are going to trade with multiple countries. We don't view this as an opening for anyone. We don't view it that way. We view it as an opportunity to reset global trade in a way that's fair for Americans after 2 or 3 decades of unfairness. If you look at some of these trade deficits, they're massive. They're massive. That has to be addressed. And that's not sustainable at the current direction it had gone. This should have been done a long time ago. President Trump's finally done it. And I think countries understand that this was different. If this was us targeting 10 countries or 5 countries, then I would understand why countries would be upset. But the truth of the matter is we're resetting tariff levels with virtually every country in the world. And so I understand if you had a deal where you were running these huge trade deficits with the United States and exporting a lot to the U.S. and built your economy around exports, but had very little import or very little economic activity coming in from the United States, I understand why you don't want that to change. But I think most mature leaders, and everybody here is a mature leader, understands that that's not a sustainable dynamic. It was one that had to be changed, and that's what the president's doing.
All right, we've heard that same rhetoric, honestly, as they've been talking about the tariffs, that the president plans to change everything because it's been, quote, unfair. What else are some of your responses to those remarks that he made? Was this an expected sort of statement from Rubio?
That's a pretty expected statement in that it reiterates the broad goals of the Trump administration's broader trade agenda. It's been a focus on the deficit, but it's worth noting that beyond just the sort of unfair trade aspect, the Trump administration has moved to impose things like demands related to military spending and a wide range of other concerns. We saw that most recently with Brazil, with a focus on political conflict, Bolsonaro, a broad range of really things that are not strictly trade related being infused into this. Not all of the countries that received a letter have a deficit in the way that Rubio just expressed there, meaning that there are quite a number of other factors that have to relate to national security, defense, spending, as well as what appears to be Trump's sort of perspective on certain leaders and their political systems being infused into these trade talks. In some ways, what Rubio said is actually a bit kind of minimizing to how sort of overarching Trump is trying to power his trade strategy.
And so we, again, have been following all of these developments here. And so I think you kind of put a nice bow on it there, talking about the overall goal of the administration. But let's head back specifically to Canada. We do know that this 35% tariff rate that's been announced is quite higher than that 25% rate that he set on Canadian goods back in February. What do you think really sparked this change? And it's going to be interesting to see how Canada ultimately responds to this 10% increase.
It's hard to know exactly what sparked the change. Canadian diplomats have indicated to us that their perception was that negotiations were ongoing in a good place. But the Trump administration has use these letters as a means to extract other forms of leverage as we kind of get down to the wire ahead of that August 1st date, meaning it's not mutually exclusive, that talks could be, in fact, going well, but the Trump administration may still want to eke out certain concessions. With regards to Canada, there's been a lot of talk about their digital regulations that the Trump administration has emphasized. We saw that they killed their so-called digital services tax, and there are quite a number of other sort of non-trade barriers that the Trump administration is trying to get at. One thing, though, that I think is notable here is that USMCA compliant goods are what is being tariffed here. And that only amounts to about 60% of trade, according to the White House.
At the end of the day, the
White House doesn't view that as all of the trade. So it's only a select amount within that overarching value, meaning that Canada, compared to other countries, is actually in a better place.
All right, Ari, we also want to put up this statement here on the screen as well. This is Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney responding to President Trump's tariff threat. He put out this statement on X saying, throughout the current trade negotiations with the United States, the Canadian government has steadfastly defended our workers and businesses. We will continue to do so as we work towards the revised deadline of August 1st. Canada has made vital progress to stop the scourge of fentanyl in North America. We are committed to continuing the work with the United States to save lives and protect communities in both of our countries. We are building Canada strong. The federal government, provinces, and territories are making significant progress in building one Canadian economy. We are poised to build a series of major new projects in the national interest. We are strengthening our trade partnerships throughout the world. That's the statement that, again, Prime Minister Mark Carney put on his X account responding to the recent President Trump tariffs that are set at 35%. But he mentioned something that I want to dive a bit deeper into here, Ari. Fentanyl has been the word that has been ringing bells. Of course, President Trump mentioning that several times, talking about the flow of fentanyl into the United States through Canadian borders. He addressed it there, saying he wants to build it stronger for both countries and to prevent the drugs from impacting others.
Yes, and the U.S. and Canada have previously made limited pacts that relate to fentanyl, specifically to address this concern that the Trump administration really has hammered. And it is an interesting focus for the Trump administration with relation to Canada. Comparatively, Mexico is a much larger driver of that, as well as precursor materials from China. Of course, there are certain trade benefits and tariff-free shipments that Canada could theoretically help sort of transmit into the United States, which aren't subject to those same regulations because of this existing free trade agreement. However, Canada's role in the U.S. Fentanyl issues nationwide is comparatively much less. And that's, I think, it kind of speaks to the broader sort of issue that Carney's trying to sort of get at here. You're getting a little bit of a sense of feeling that we have made progress, that we're trying to build up this economy and work with the U.S. And it appears that they might be a little bit insulted that the Trump administration does not necessarily see it like that. And that's a perspective that I think is shared with a lot of other allies, particularly Japan and South Korea, which also received those letters about tariff hikes.
And so lastly, Ari, before I let you go, we were just putting up that tweet as well, discussing the latest headlines from Forbes as we're talking about these new tariffs. Ultimately, Ari, as we're continuing to see how the market has been responding to these tariff threats, we have a live vantage point right now as well of the Dow. I want to put this up on the screen. It's been very volatile, and we've heard concern as well from some of those folks and economics talking about what we're seeing, the market in the red today. It's going to be interesting to see what comes, especially on August 1st, as we have already seen the market responding to this announcement.
Yes, how the market is going to respond is quite notable. And it's worth noting that even though we're seeing quite a lot of volatility in the market is not responding the exact same way as it did in the early days of Trump's tariff threats. There was a much stronger reaction when we saw those initial 25% tariffs that were announced on Canada, as well as the so-called reciprocal tariffs on dozens of countries, meaning that while the market is still reacting, and Trump does care about that quite a bit, the reaction can be a bit delayed. It's a bit more muted compared to how it was prior, because the market, just like all of the spectators of the tariffs, are not 100% certain what's actually happening here, whether or not these tariffs are actually set. Remember, there are quite a number of court cases in effect. Theoretically, much of these tariffs could be struck down by the Supreme Court. So there is quite a market reaction here, but how that will adjust to these sort of perpetual threats that might not be set in stone is definitely wavering a bit.
And lastly, before I let you go, Ari, again, as we're talking about these tariff threats and the goods, the specific goods that are going to be tariffed as of August 1st, does the U.S. have other options, or will we have to then sort of adapt to the new higher prices that will ultimately be a result of the tariffs?
Unless the tariffs are struck down, the immediate impact will be a slight rise in prices, and then the long-term economic implications are a bit tougher to observe. But as of now, it's not realistic for the United States to rebuild manufacturing capacity for all of the critical materials that we receive from countries like China, Mexico, Canada, meaning that prices are inclined to go higher. Rebuilding back manufacturing in the U.S. is a decades-long process, and getting that going, while this might sort of kick that into gear a little bit faster, there's still quite a lot of time where domestic demand will just outpace supply greatly.
And there he is, Ari Hawkins with Politico, helping us to break down this latest headline out of the White House as Canadian goods imported to the U.S. are set to face a blanket 35% tariff starting next month. This all according to President Trump's announcement that he said just yesterday. Of course, we've been following the very latest with these tariffs over the last few months as President Trump has made it a major piece of this administration. Ari, we appreciate you as always for helping us to understand some of the more in-depth conversation behind the headlines.
Thank you very much for having me.